So now Rebecca Mcintosh is going to talk about, well, seals. And you're from Phillip Island Nature Park, so thanks very much for coming down, Rebecca.
Thanks everyone for having me. So I'll quickly do a bit of positioning. I think positioning is really important for conversations. I'm non-Indigenous. I am a practitioner of Western science, so I come from a hypothesis testing background, but I'm trying to moonlight into all sorts of other sectors and be more transdisciplinary in my approach. I'd like to acknowledge the Gulligen, is that how you say it correctly? I hope, lands that we're on today, and acknowledge also the Eastern Maar and Gunditjmara nations where a lot of the research has been done that I'm going to talk about today. To be completely transparent, all the research I present today was done without traditional owner engagement, and Phillip Island Nature Parks are determined and committed to changing that. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bunurong lands of the Sea Country and Phillip Island where I live, work and play. Hopefully you'll enjoy learning a bit about the seals. So I'm going to talk about the brief history of the seals as we know it. Often from a Western perspective, it starts with them being largely wiped out by the commercial sealers that came from Europe. And that's the start of the conversation. There's a lot more to the story. But that's not my intellectual property and I won't talk about it today except to touch on it. I just want to recognise it. I'll talk about the different species you might see in the Always Coast all the way to Cape Bridgewater near South Australian border. Their population trends of the main species that breed along these coasts and their foraging ranges. I'm keeping it pretty simple because I don't want to overwhelm you, but also I could talk about them forever. So if you want to know more, please just ask me. So as I said, the sealers were first contact in most of Victoria, indeed along the southern coast of Australia. And you may not realise it, but there were 4 seal species breeding in Bass Strait at this time. And they were wiped out pretty much in 40 to 50 years. Can you imagine what taking 4 top predators out of an ecosystem does to that ecosystem? So we are dealing right now with a drastically changed marine system out there, and it's been drastically changed since before Melbourne was even a thing. So there were elephant seals, sea lions that are now just in South Australia and Western Australia, the black fur seal or longnose or New Zealand fur seal, and the brown fur seal, the Australian fur seal. And this is a population trend that I've reconstructed from a lot of other people's work. But it's pretty common across the globe for many species. I think you could all look at this and think, well, that looks pretty similar to da-da-da-da-da-da. But basically, they were nearly wiped out in a really short period of time. But I want to acknowledge that there's over 8,000 years of records in middens across Australia. So there was cultural use of these animals. And that connection continues today. And I want to acknowledge that here in this space. They pretty much didn't recover until they were protected in 1975. And then I thought, when I started at the nature parks in 2013, I thought, oh, fantastic, I'm moving from the Australian sea lion, which I'm not supposed to have favourites, but they're my favourite, which was declining and still is. I thought I'll get to work on this species that's a success story for conservation. And then the very first census I did in 2013 showed that they'd declined. And their peak was around 2007. The grey areas are uncertainty. So in those earlier periods from 1750 to 1800, they're from records off the sealing boats. Doesn't include any of the seals that ended up in China. So this is an underestimate. But basically what we're looking at now is a population that's a third to a half of what it might have been, or possibly even less. So when people think there's lots of seals out there and call them the rats of the sea, there's only mainly one species in Bass Strait, and there's a lot fewer than there ever were. So we are dealing with shifting baselines here. What you remember in your short history of seals is very different from what the ecosystem would have looked like 200 years ago. This is Marringmum in Boonwurrung language. That's the Australian fur seal out on Seal Rocks. They're kind of more like a sea lion. They feed off the benthos off the bottom of the ocean, and they're bigger. But I call them the bullfeds because they're a bit slow and they're nice, so they're not as aggressive as the other species. So this is the latest census we did in 2017. And the size of the circle represents how many pups are born in a site. The colour is whether it's declining or increasing, so red is declining. And a triangle is a site that we've recently identified as a new breeding site in Tasmania, is where they mostly are. But we've also seen a few pups come up at Marengo Reef. So we've got a meta population that's really complex, and some of the sites are increasing while others are decreasing. But the long-term established breeding colonies are the ones that are showing the greatest declines across the range. Today I'm going to focus mostly on Deen Maar Island and Cape Bridgewater because with Eastern Maar we're having quite a few conversations around Deen Maar. And this is the long-nosed or New Zealand fur seal. We gave it a name change. I don't know if you know about it, but in South Australia they can be quite heavily demonised for eating seabirds. And at one point there was a news article that was like, the murderous seals of the ocean. I was like, quick, lock your doors, they're coming. But they're really beautiful, amazing animals. They've got this longer, pointier nose, big white whiskers, and they were in Bass Strait before the Australian fur seal came over from South Africa. So they've been here for a long time. They're not interlopers from New Zealand. They've been here for a very long time. And these are their trends that Sarah Lena worked on in the last several years, and they are recolonising Bass Strait. This is a success story. It does mean they're going to eat a few seabirds, but we have quite a few penguins at Phillip Island, so hopefully we'll be right. I don't want to minimise that, by the way. I'm just having a bit of fun. But you can see across the whole space that we're dealing with increases, and a lot of the main increases are happening in southern Tasmania, where they're overlapping a lot with aquaculture. This is the Australian sea lion. So I call him this fella Fabio, with his beautiful big blonde mane. They come across from South Australia into Cape Bridgewater quite regularly, the males. And it's interesting for fur seals, they often first start colonising a place by the males showing up. So I'm desperately excited that maybe one day we might see a female at Cape Bridgewater, but maybe not. This is a Australian sea lion, young male, interacting with a long-nosed fur seal. Who knows the difference between an otarid and a phocid? Hands? There's a few, great. So otarids have got those little ears, little external ears. They run on their foreflippers, and they're quite a different beast. They're like the dogs of the sea. They're really interactive. Phocids wriggle on their bellies, and they're mostly in Antarctica, but they do visit every now and then. So the breeding animals we've got are otarids, these eared seals. And here we've got a sea lion with a long-nosed fur seal and Australian fur seal at Cape Bridgewater. It's one of the places where you can go and see up to 4 species all at once. It's really biodiverse for seals, and it might be one of the only places in Australia where you can actually see them all in the one place. You'll get the odd sub-Antarctic fur seal turn up. Here's the subby there in the corner. It's not a great photo, sorry, but we took it from a boat. That's at Cape Bridgewater. And you'll get the odd leopard seal. Now we're turning into phocid territory. Can you see the difference? Elephant seals, Warrnambool, one of my friends. And crab eaters. Now this is a less common visitor. So if you might remember, elephant seals used to breed in Bass Strait, so it's not that surprising that they're turning up. Crab eaters are purely Antarctic, so when they show up, this is really unusual. They're not really, we haven't seen evidence of them in midden records, and this could be a bit of a climate change phenomenon that they're starting to show up a bit, but we're not sure. They've got a lot of threats. All those squiggly lines don't mean anything except for my brain, so you can feel sorry for me. But lots of things affect the fur seals. And I wrote a list of these and started doing research on them, and I hope to cross some off, but unfortunately they're all getting ticked. If you want to know about any of them, you can contact me. But everything from oil spills to aquaculture to plastics to land runoff, what happens on land affects the ocean. And the algal bloom in South Australia is an absolute testament to that. So it's all connected. This is Deen Maar Island from the boat. And as I said, all this previous work I'm about to show you was done without collaboration and engagement, but that's hopefully all about to change. The longnose is in yellow and the Australians are in pink, so they both breed on the island. And this is them enjoying a wave. So you've got the Australian fur seal pups on the left and the long-nosed fur seal pups on the right. And you'll notice a large difference in the pup scales, which is the y-axis. So basically at Deen Maar Island, we've seen over a 52% decline in pup numbers there since 2007. We've seen a slight increase in long-nosed fur seals, but you could equally put a parabola through that and you might see a bit of a change of a decline too. So we're not quite sure. So the last surveys we did in 2017, so we're hoping to do an update to this and see where we're at now. How cute are those puppies? Like the long nose, it looks so cute, but they're little gremlins. So this is Cape Bridgewater, and again, you've got both species, and the long-nosed fur seals breed along the ocean coast, which is to the south there, and inside the bay. And I've drawn a bit of more blue there because they've actually extended since we made this map. While the Australians are in that cave, beautiful sea cave, which has 2 entrances. And that's possibly one of the reasons they survive sealing better than the other species, because they actually breed in caves as well as on the coast. And the other thing about Cape Bridgewater is that it's an example of the seals starting to breed on the mainland, which is a relatively new phenomenon around the globe. Now that we're not hunting them, we are seeing places where they're breeding on the mainland. Also, like in California, no more land predators, no more bear and things eating them. So we're getting elephant seals breeding on the mainland too. So this is a phenomenon that's happening around the world now that they're not being hunted. This is what it looks like trying to do a survey through the ocean side of Cape Bridgewater. You've only got a little strip there of rock right under the 100-metre cliffs. And it gets pretty interesting when you've got a breeding bull trying to tell you he doesn't want you to pass. So we try to go in when the breeding season's finished. The reason we work on the pups is because they're the only age cohort before they start entering the water that is all on land at once. And females don't have twins. So we know that 1 pup is 1 female. And there's a magic number between 3.5 and 4.5. You can multiply the pup numbers by, and that's your population estimate. So at Cape Bridgewater, they're similar sort of population size for the Australian fur seals in the cave and the long-nosed fur seals on the coast. But I actually think there's a lot more long-nosed there now because we haven't done a count since 2017. Now to where they forage. This is a Aussie fur seal male with an old Kiwi sat tracker on his back. You just glue it to the fur, and then when they molt it falls off, or you can recatch the animal if you're lucky and cut it off. This is the female. So basically they radiate out from wherever they're tracked from. And you'll notice that there might be some gaps there, but there's all those islands in the Tasmanian waters we haven't tracked any animals from. So I actually think it would probably be pretty full in Bass Strait for where they're foraging. Females are central place foragers. They have to come back and feed their pup. Their pups are relying on their milk. But even so, they travel vast different distances. Hopefully this will work. So you can see that the Australian fur seal is completely reliant on being on the shelf. It doesn't go into deep waters at all. And that means it comes into contact with a lot more of our activities as well, and a lot more pollutants and a lot more industry, fishing industry. So that could be one of the reasons why they're not doing as well as the long-nosed fur seals. This is a young male we tracked from Cape Bridgewater. This is a new device. It's got big bumpers on there because otherwise they rub their backs and they scratch the antennas up. Now these guys are quite different. This is when we tracked 5 of them. This is when they just stick around Cape Bridgewater. But then at some point they decide to take off. And in this example, it was mostly when I showed up to try to catch them again, to use the tracker again. They weren't too happy about that, and they took off and went right down to the subantarctic convergence zone in 4,000 metres depth of water. And they're feeding on Mcintosh down there that are coming up with the moon. So they're a completely different animal doing completely different things. In summary, they're both still recovering from exploitation, but I'll predict, Nick, you can see what happens. Maybe I'll be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I think that the long-nosed fur seals will do better than the Aussie fur seals, and the Aussie fur seals might start making more of a stronghold in Tasmania rather than Bass Strait. At Deen Maar Island, we've seen a big decline, and we don't know where that status is at now. But there's hopefully up around 3,000 pups there. Long-nosed fur seals are stable, but they've always been at really low numbers. Only about 20 pups are born at Deen Maar Island for the long-nosed fur seals. At Cape Bridgewater, both the species have been increasing. I really don't know how many more Aussie fur seals can fit in that cave though. Like, it's pretty dense. And we did have a heat wave. I think it was a heat wave. We couldn't completely pin it on what it might have been, where we had quite a high mortality event in there. Luckily, I had a vet with me, and we think that the mortality was caused by just getting too hot. So lots of other seals visit. It's a really important area. And the Aussie fur seals might be interacting with us a lot more than the long-nosed fur seals, which could be part of the explanation for their different trends. And thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. We do have time for questions.
Just wondering, is there a loss of habitat that could be a big cause of this problem?
Yes, so we've got a project going at the moment with Bunurong Land Council and Monash Uni called Lost at Sea, and we are measuring ocean inundation at some sites. Some of them are really low-lying, and the waters are definitely encroaching, and pups, it's quite interesting, that black lanugo coat they have, it's really resistant to heat, but it's not so resistant to cold. So if they get wet too often while they're little and not swimming, then it can affect their ability to thermoregulate. Also, there's possibility of drowning because they're not born knowing how to swim, they have to learn. Yes, so there's quite a few sites we think are going to become less and less habitable for the seals in the future with sea level rise, and storm surge is a big problem. Deen Maar Island might be one of the few refuges because they can actually climb up onto the top of Deen Maar Island.
Thanks so much.